The biggest surprise to me about fasting was all the things that improved which I had no expectation of improving. I only started extended fasting to lose some weight because of blood pressure issues, and I didn't expect to see any blood pressure improvement until I lost a good 20 pounds, which is typically how it goes when you go on a standard diet. To my shock, after a month of doing 72 to 96 hour fasts every week, my blood pressure measured as perfect. That is what sent me down the fasting rabbit hole, trying to find out why fasting has such a profound effect in such a short time. I do find if I slack off for a while, the high blood pressure comes back though, so realize it does take a lifestyle commitment. And that's why I do a 36-hour fast every week, just to keep the benefits. And then I still do a 72 to 96-hour fast once a month, so I can get even more benefits. Even more surprising than the blood pressure was other issues that I believed were permanent issues that could never be resolved. This includes sciatica, which I mentioned in another video recently, and also tinnitus, which is an annoying and even painful ringing in the ears. This can also make it difficult or impossible to hear, and the medical industry really doesn't do much for people who have this kind of issue.
I can't believe what I am lip reading here today. Now, I may not be able to hear with these, but you people, you can't hear with this.
First off, I want to talk a bit about the recent events involving an insurance CEO's demise and the medical industry in general. Many people have come down hard against the CEO, but while some insurance companies are pretty bad, they are actually the good guys in some sense within the medical industry, as they're the only ones that are holding the rest of the farcical system in line at all, especially as far as costs go. There are a bunch of serious problems, but one of the main ones is that the vast majority of pharmaceutical company budget goes to marketing, which directly drives the prices up. It also encourages everyone to self-diagnose major diseases and beg their doctor for every dangerous quack med like Quackzempic that manages to weasel its way through the approval process and get approved by characters like Fauci.
It's easy to criticize, but they're really criticizing science because I represent science.
Yeah, well, you know, that's just like your opinion, man.
In fact, the FDA is actually worse than the CDC, not better. Another big issue is the government student loan system. As soon as our questionable government started to allow student loans to be undefaultable, lo and behold, the prices of college went up by about 10 times what they used to be, even though salaries for the people graduating were pretty much the same. The universities also fund large numbers of scholarships, all chosen with political and identity-based motivation. Thankfully, my education was paid for by the university because I had family on the faculty, but at the time it was pretty reasonable, and I could have even paid the tuition myself, because I already had a full-time job making decent money at the time. To get the same education today would cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, which I would have to pay back over decades like a house payment, and also that I could pay for half a dozen other less deserving students to get a free education on scholarships that I was actually paying for. MIT is known for rejecting students with a 1600 SAT score. That is a perfect SAT score, because the student didn't quote-unquote fit their criteria. Not once, but many times now. So it's being decided who gets a good education and therefore a good job based on politics and traits people are born with. That has nothing to do with their qualifications, and ironically, it's done in the name of justice. And the money comes not from the government, but directly from those who take out these ridiculous student loans to get a less and less valuable education. This is also how our doctors are being selected, and how the engineers at Boeing and Intel are being selected, which is why these companies are completely failing to make working and competitive products today. Nobody would buy an Intel computer today. And I personally would stay away from a Boeing airline no matter what. Another big issue with education is online schooling. Almost all degree programs can be taken online now at almost every college, and the tests are almost always multiple choice. They are also done from home, so there's nothing to prove who actually answered the questions. K through 12 education also functions like this now in the United States, and this is probably the reason Gen Z people are often immediately fired from their first job. They've never been held to any sort of accountability or discipline, and they've never actually done any real work of any kind. Then they get to their first job and they're totally unprepared, and they've also never done any reading or any learning, and I think by the time you're 18, it may actually be too late to really have your intellect grow to what it could have been. I'd also say that one of the best things about my school time was talking to really smart people, not just the professors and lecturers, but also many of the students who are already doing very interesting things, some of which really surprised me. You're not going to get this from logging into a server. I went to a state school even though I had very good SAT scores, which used to be what determined who goes to the Ivy League schools. I was surprised that most of my professors in my major were from Princeton, and many had some amazing backgrounds working in things like cutting-edge, top-secret research. And one of them told me he had left Princeton because he was no longer allowed to fail students or to assign as much homework as he wanted to. And now this guy was a very punishing professor. So at the time I didn't really make that much of this, but at this point it's become widely known, and it's become much worse in recent times that Princeton and a lot of these Ivy League schools, basically all of them, just don't have any standards anymore, and they don't hold you to any sort of discipline. They're just not teaching you anything. And that was 30 years ago, so I imagine things have gotten dramatically worse since then, and it seems like the whole Ivy League is just going down at this point. Doctors also generally no longer take a real science degree for pre-med, but they take neuroscience instead. This sounds fancy and technical, but it's actually mostly psychology and other pop science nonsense. So all most doctors today have for scientific background is some entry-level chemistry and biochem classes that are required to meet pre-med requirements and insignificant levels of math knowledge. And they don't really learn more of that kind of thing in medical school, which is all about learning diagnostics, which is a doctor's real job. So how is a doctor to analyze science for you? While many of the smartest people in the world become doctors, most of them can't today because they're just not trained to. They have to rely on folks like our friend Fauci and the peer review boards. These peer review boards analyze data that is carefully kept secret from the public, including from the doctors themselves. So even if they had this ability, there's simply no access for them to go in and look at the raw data and see what the truth is. Recently, there was a case where the judge refused to show video that was recorded of a crime that occurred at Snake River, and they only showed the jurors a few scary screenshots from the video, which were heavily edited, and someone was sent to prison for what amounts to a life sentence based on this absurdity. This is very similar to how science is being decided behind closed doors for us. If the data sets were open, then much smarter mathematics professors and post-grad researchers and actuaries and so on could easily tell us how valid it really is. This is what they're qualified to do, and the people on these peer review boards really aren't qualified to do this. And the reason that they're carefully hiding this data is because this will allow people to tear apart their studies and show that they're a load of garbage. Expensive medication trials are also something that were pushed by Big Pharma, just like endless regulations for the auto industry are pushed in that industry. At one time, corporations pushed hard against regulations. Now they've weaponized them against everyone else. This makes it impossible for real competition to develop, and this dramatically drives up the price of their products. This allows for collusion between the big players, and they can just set their prices to whatever they want, and everyone else is just forced to pay. This is also why nationalized medicine has failed. Instead of a check on big corporations, it's become a tool to allow them to jack prices ever higher and always be sure that they get their payment in the end. Today, if you want to avoid disaster, you have to essentially educate yourself and be able to tell if your diagnosis makes sense and look at alternatives, and to demand to go to a specialist if there's any chance that you might have a serious problem, or you're just not going to go and you're not going to find out. You also have to know the ins and outs of the medical system and be aggressive about forcing them to treat you. The pay for your doctor is based on how little the doctor spends caring for you, leading them to endlessly gaslight you that serious symptoms are not a big issue. When it comes to cancer, it tends to go well when caught early, but when it has progressed a bit, it has almost always had a bad outcome. And I see that all the time when people talking about their cancer stories. Their doctor said, no, it's fine, you just have gastrointestinal issues and so on. And then a year later, they're dead. My mother actually had the same insurance company this now famous CEO operated. And when she had a brain aneurysm, she had to fight the insurance company not only to get the operation, but also to get the test to see if she had one or not.
I've accepted it. Why can't you? I've got a spike through my head, a spike through my head, spike through my head, a spike through my head, a spike through my head. Read it. It says Pennsylvania Steel.
Again and again, doctors tried to gaslight her as this saves them time and money, but she persisted and finally got confirmation from the insurance and a good brain surgeon, and that brain surgeon saved her life. People will claim that socialism is better, but in socialism, the doctors work for the state, and the state wants to cut costs. And the issues are just as bad there, or even worse. As long as you have the profit in the drug companies in the picture, it's always going to have problems. Everything has a fixed policy in these systems, and if you don't meet the requirements, you just don't get treated. They do much less testing than in America for these worst diseases like cancer, that are very costly to treat, and therefore if you have cancer or if you have a brain aneurysm in the UK or Canada, you're just pretty much done. You won't even know until it's too late, let alone get treated. And Dr. Anthony Chaffee talks a bit about this with some of his patients when he was a brain surgeon in Ireland. And you have to realize that your government is not always your friend. In China, for example, the Wuhan area is very disliked by the regime.
He's right. Do you know that?
This is because there are many dissidents in the area, and they barely lifted a finger during some recent disasters. And the same thing is happening right now in North Carolina, where not only is the government doing little to help, but it's arresting people for trying to help. So don't trust the government to help you. They're never really your friend, even if they try to make it seem like they are. No matter what time or place you live in, even the best government in the best time is always the number one bad guy in your life. This will always be true because they have much more power over you than anyone else. There will always be some form of government, and without it we'd be enslaved by gangs or corporations. But the main job of the government should be to limit the power or even eliminate these predatory entities, not to promote them as it does today. These are the issues we face, and I think eliminating student loans that can't be defaulted, nationalizing, aka eliminating drug companies that make overpriced or outright scam products, and making all education placement based on standardized tests is the only way to turn things around. Otherwise, healthcare will be just what Intel and Boeing are today, and they are essentially scam companies no one willingly buys from or uses anymore. Intel used to be the best company for computers, but it's now a joke. Boeing went from the safest company in the world to the most dangerous. The same holds true for our healthcare, and the same factors of corporate capture of our university system and the government agencies are what's ultimately driving this. People also don't realize it's actually the taxpayer that pays for all the real medication research already anyway. And this all comes through NIH funding. And then the company just comes along and does marketing and trials and reaps massive profits. This is exactly how the safe and effective treatments were developed. These companies today literally don't do anything of value, they're just parasites. We really don't need new medications anyway. Medications are just a profitable treatment paradigm that's easy to capitalize on and to drive up expenses. I hope that RFK Jr. can truly make America healthy again, but there are many problems to overcome, and there are trillions of dollars at stake, not just with drug companies, but also with the processed junk food companies. The people who are supposed to be watchdogs are funded by and connected to industry, and they even have presidential pardons in some cases. That means RFK has to worry not only about every politician having his pockets stuffed with green, blocking him, or even about being tarred and feathered in the media by endless PR campaigns paid for by these companies, but also for his very physical well-being. That means essentially we're on our own. My solution turned out to be fasting, and it seems to be the solution to not only my main problem, but many others I had, and something that will aid in all healing in the body, and which is the most efficient way to lose fat without losing muscle or slowing the metabolism, so long as you keep the fasting period to 96 hours or less. The reason this works so well is that these chronic diseases or diseases that were rare before the modern diet and lifestyle became common, they are really mainly diseases of metabolic health, and today over 90% of the population have poor metabolic health. There are even babies being born with type 2 diabetes today, while a low-carb diet or even a whole foods vegan diet, while highly deficient in many nutrients and leading to high homocysteine, can slowly correct some of these issues. Fasting does so many times more quickly, and also repairs the immune bodies which are required to repair all damage in the body, so you can get results in months instead of years. Though of course it is better to combine diet with fasting and get even more benefits. And one of my viewers can confirm this. Her name is T, and she just told me she's been carnivore for over a year, and she had a homocysteine of 28. Then she started doing some fasting and taking the supplement TMG, which I recommend for homocysteine, and now it's down to 6. Tinnitus is a multifactorial disease and has several apparent mechanisms by which these terrible symptoms can occur. I would not call these causes per se, but they do cause the symptoms themselves. First off, there is actual scarring on the most delicate parts of the ear. This is physical damage that the body can theoretically heal, but as we age, we get more and more damage, and our healing ability gets less and less. The second mechanism is related to the nerve receptors themselves. Neuroinflammation causes them to randomly trigger pain or incorrect sensation signals. The third important one is neuronal health. When the neurons that sense sound die off, you can no longer get a signal from the ear at all. This causes the brain to create incorrect information as it desperately tries to make sense of the lack of input. This causes weird noises like ringing in the ear, and it can even cause auditory hallucinations like voices or roaring of monsters or something like that. Physical scarring can be reabsorbed over time, but it's a slow process and becomes much slower as we age. Thankfully, fasting, taurine, and phototherapy can all speed up this process. I got a little shrinkage of scars from fasting, but the thing that helped the most was supplementing taurine. One day I just looked down and noticed some burn scars on my arms were simply gone, and I can only see a faint little bit of them if I look very closely. That was not an expected benefit of taurine, but due to taurine's role in phagocytosis, combined with the fact the modern diet, including meat cuts, are very deficient, it does make sense. And since you're not eating the heart, most likely, or the tongue, or the cheeks, or the oxtail for most people, then you're probably deficient in taurine too, even if you eat loads of meat. Phototherapy can reduce improper pain signals from pain receptors by over 70%. And this is another big factor when it comes to tinnitus. This should apply to pain in all areas of the body. This occurs basically due to insulin resistance and inflammation in the nerves that leads to faulty signals or even nerve death. In other words, this is another form of peripheral neuropathy, and that is something that phototherapy helps a lot with. And most people don't realize that this is probably the biggest source of back pain too. Back pain just isn't something that people have if they're living in a small African village or even if they're living in Iraq. And no matter what their age is, it's not injury, it's not something else, it's neuropathy. What helps even more though is fasting. which can bring down swelling permanently over time, because fasting quickly brings down insulin, and insulin is what really drives swelling, inflammation, and blood pressure in the body, which is based on how much volume of water you have in the body.
And it can still work quite well at the kidney level. And one of the jobs of insulin at the kidney level is to actually hold on to sodium. So that's actually a much more important factor for increasing the sodium in your body and causing high blood pressure than is the amount of sodium that you consume. If you consume a modicum of sodium but have very high insulin levels, your body's going to try very hard to hold on to all of that sodium. You can, on the other hand, consume a whole lot of sodium but have very good low insulin levels, and any excess sodium that you consume will just come out in your urine.
Diet is also going to help here. The lower your carbs are, the lower your chronic insulin levels are going to be, though they tend to go down very slowly from diet alone. And as soon as you eat something that's a cheat food, it's going to come flooding right back. Perhaps the biggest issue is in your neurons in your brain and in your ear. These tend to slowly die out over time, but these are needed by your ears and your brain to process the signals that the ears send and make sense of them. Diet can slow this down by reducing the reactive oxygen species produced in cellular metabolism, which is at least 60% greater when you're burning carbs instead of fat. These byproducts kill off mitochondria over time and eventually lead to cell death. However, it's difficult to get very high levels of ketones except through fasting, which can generate 10 times the level of a keto diet. So for your brain, you really need some occasional fasting to take the pressure off of the neurons in your brain. Fasting can also greatly increase the health of neuronal mitochondria, and it is when the mitochondria all run out in a neuron that it ultimately just dies, and that's true of all cells, but unfortunately your neurons don't really get replaced very easily. And unfortunately your brain cells can't use any form of fat except for ketones, because the blood-brain barrier keeps the free fatty acids from passing through to the brain. If you're over 50, chances are good you've already lost most of your hearing-related neurons. A hearing test will confirm this easily, and you'll probably be shocked to find that you simply can't hear most frequency ranges anymore. And this is how it is for the average person today. Thankfully, fasting can do a great deal to stimulate stem cell release, which can lead to the creation of new neurons in the hippocampus, which will then migrate to the appropriate areas in the body, including the ears and also the heart. I wish I'd tested my hearing before I started fasting, because I'm proud to say after having an ear test a while back, I can hear as well as an 18-year-old today. And I would bet that this was not the case before I started fasting. Unfortunately, I didn't have a test, so I don't really know for sure. On the other hand, I can say that I tested my reflexes before fasting, which is also controlled by neuron health. Before fasting, I was at a 250 millisecond reaction time, which is pretty typical for someone in their 40s, and that's when I took it. After fasting for about a year, I tried again, and it was 160 milliseconds. And this is a great score for any age. In fact, most people are never going to be at this level. I'm convinced that fasting is going to have the most benefits by far, but there are many supplements that can help here as well, especially the ones linked in the video description like taurine, glycine, L-cysteine, and even vitamin D. With the supplements, they may not have the seemingly miraculous and instantaneous benefits that fasting can sometimes have, but some like taurine are pretty amazing in their own right and have really surprised me in what it can do for myself and also for other people. They're basically something for nothing because they really cost pennies per serving, and while fasting and low carb can take a long time to embrace and they can be difficult to stick to, you can do this right away and for a very low cost. Phototherapy will also help here as well and is shown to stimulate stem cell release for healing. So that's another thing that's also very low effort, and you can do this easily for about $30. There's many problems with our medical system today, whether you struggle under a paid system or a nationalized one. And the main problem is industry control over universities and governmental agencies and how they affect medical care and the food supply. Because of this, we have to keep on top of our own problems and prevent as many of them as possible from developing in the first place through lower carb diets, getting rid of all packaged food if you can, reducing grains especially, just generally proper nutrition that has lots of animal products in it, which have over 30 nutrients not found in plants, and healthy lifestyle practices like fasting. They're probably the most important thing if you already have damage. Many problems just don't have a solution in the realm of medical science. There's no pill that's going to take your tinnitus away, and there's no operation either. Thankfully, tinnitus is yet another disease that is largely a disease of metabolic derangement, and I found it helped me a great deal with tinnitus just to do some fasting. The mechanisms involved in the disease all respond to fasting, phototherapy, and certain inexpensive supplements like taurine, glycine, and L-cysteine, which can be found in the description of the video. I also just wanted to thank the people like Soapy and Gary and T and Ian and Mel and Paul and April and all the other people who thumb up every video just one more time. Once the platform sees people ignoring a video, it just shuts off the video like a light switch. So you guys are really what keeps the channel going, and without you, new people are never going to see it at all, and there's just going to be no one subscribing and no one watching. And not to mention all the people who are kind enough to become members of the channel. And it's very humbling to see that people are willing to go to that length to give support for me and the channel. If we can reach more people, then that's the true hope that we have, because then people will demand that things change and we're no longer being poisoned by our foods and our doctors. And that's the future of health, not only for this country, but for the entire planet. The truth is simply all we have to make sure that the bad guys don't win and destroy us all.
So we'll take down all the wheelchair accessible ramps and replace them with large bumps.
Your new society sounds charming.
So the local bump manufacturer can make more money? Well, if that's your idea of America, then count me out.